From the studios of Clean Fuels Alliance America, this is the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast. Fascinating ideas and conversations in the world of biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel. Now, here's your host, Scott Tremaine.
And welcome. This week, a discussion on the Sustainable Aviation Fuel 40B tax credit with Clean Fuel CEO Donnell Rehagen, Vice President Federal Affairs Kurt Kovarik, and Director of Environmental Science Veronica Bradley.
Well, thanks, Scott. And Kurt, Veronica, thanks for joining us this week. We said last week when we kind of went into a little bit of a SAF 101 with Veronica and Jonathan Martin, that we'd come back and do a little bit of a deeper dive, especially with a little more knowledge of what happens from the 40B guidance that we got just a couple of weeks ago. So here we are, wanting to kind of dive in a little bit deeper on all of that. So again, thanks for joining me here. Maybe easiest, just Kurt, let me kick it to you first, maybe, and just start us off with what do we know about 40B that we didn't know before, and where are we going?
Thanks, Donnell. Always glad to be on the Better, Cleaner Now podcast. Yeah, so 40B is essentially the provision of the tax code that created in the Inflation Reduction Act the blender's tax credit for the production of sustainable aviation fuel. So for folks listening, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed way back in August of 2022 and included a whole host of measures, a lot in the tax code meant to address climate change. 40B is one of them, the first ever tax incentive for sustainable aviation fuel, and first ever, importantly, tax incentive based on the carbon intensity of the fuel. So not just meeting a benchmark or a threshold, but actually incentivizing greater reductions. The more you reduce the carbon in the fuel, the more value that the credit provides. This is, this being the first time that the IRS and Treasury have ever had to navigate a tax incentive based on carbon intensity. It's a little unsure, obviously, at the time how this was going to come out. Many months of lobbying took place by folks on all sides of the issue. And what we saw on April 30th was the final guidance implementing the 40B tax incentive. We knew that this was going to be a bit of a fight in terms of ensuring that it was based on sound science. One of the items that we pointed to was a utilization of the Argonne National Laboratory's GREET model, which has existed for a long time. We all view as the gold standard in terms of measuring biofuels, particularly for their life cycle carbon emissions. But that's about the depth of my knowledge on it. Joking there a little bit, but that's why I'm glad we have with us Veronica Bradley, our Director of Environmental Science. She's kind of the technical expertise in this area with engaging on the carbon modeling. She's done a lot of work in this area, so I might kind of turn it to her. Maybe a softball here for you, Veronica. What is the GREET model? What is a carbon measurement tool? What does it measure, and what are all the components that go into it to help us understand kind of what is the measuring stick first?
Yeah. Well, and as the sciencey nerd, I wouldn't want to call it a measurement tool because it's really using greenhouse gas accounting to kind of develop numbers on a kind of relative scale. So you take carbon intensity, life cycle assessment in the fuel space, and everything is kind of what is the difference between that and petroleum? So you have kind of the system boundaries of producing the feedstock, producing the fuel, the transportation of the feedstock and the fuel to the distribution, and incorporating kind of the use of the fuel, so just the general combustion and tailpipe emissions. And the idea with biofuels, of course, is that because you have a biogenic or renewable feedstock, you don't have the carbon emissions that you have associated with petroleum. So the GREET model, which, we don't need to belabor what it stands for, but it's the Greenhouse Gases Regulated Emissions. I can't even say it.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
And Energy and Technologies model, GREET, right? And it started really transportation decades ago. And as you said, it is the gold standard. It's used as a measuring stick comparing our renewable fuels to petroleum fuels in a wide variety of programs, state level, international, everything. Even the CORSIA methodology that's referenced in 40B does rely on uniquely created a GREET model for the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, that created CORSIA.
Now, the GREET model obviously measures both direct emissions, but then there's kind of this fuzzy area of indirect.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of focus, particularly for biofuels, is on. Everybody understands, and maybe you can explain again what the direct effects are, but direct effects are the energy used to produce the crop, to harvest the crop, convert the crop into a biofuel, and then the emissions emitted as you use the fuel. But a little bit murkier is this concept of indirect land use change, or just indirect emissions generally. Can you, in a layman's term, what are we talking about when we talk about indirect effects?
I feel like layman's is even challenging to explain indirect emissions, I've had conversations with the folks at Argonne where they're like, we really don't want to get into that. We don't want to get into the indirect side. And most people who are, kind of engineers, strictly thinking about what we know and don't know, don't want to get into it because it's all hypothetical. But essentially, the origin of this modeling around indirect emissions is based on the idea that there was, this concern back at the beginning days of ethanol production that you're just going to convert all of the virgin lands, the native grasses, the forests to cropland to produce this new fuel. And so it's a very intensive, data intensive, modeling intensive, expert judgment intensive modeling process to kind of avoid that potential problem by adding that penalty to our crop-based fuels. My personal opinion is that it's way too much work to come up with the solution for that concern.
And don't we have 25 years now of real world data and experience? I mean, we've had the renewable fuel standard driving biofuels use since 2005. Are we still modeling the effects of land use changes, or can we actually look at historical data and whether or not, and I think my point here is, Veronica, is that to a great extent, what was predicted on land use changes hasn't materialized. And mostly that's primarily because of the innovation in the ag sector and the efficiency gains, producing more, using the same or less inputs and less land. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that, the origin of the idea was really a concern about if the entire globe, if every jurisdiction in the country decided to convert to ethanol over gasoline, for example, like we'd be concerned. There's a potential concern there, but having unique programs, domestic programs, state level programs, that's not going to have really the impact that is projected in these models. And I think really what the solution to this problem, which is really kind of a problem in itself, was kind of creating this model that you can't show in reality because it's indirect. It's all these induced interactions in trade that you can't prove or disprove that the biofuel policy itself is causing that. But so we're gonna hypothetically, what could it be? So if we took out the biofuel policy, what is kind of the nature of cropland extensification around the world? And so to your point, I don't think it's borne out, but at the same time, you can't really disprove it by saying that it hasn't been borne out, because it could really be that if we didn't have the policy, we'd have all of these newly reforested lands.
Sure.
So it's just it's a kind of a mess.
I would imagine from perspective of scientists, they don't like to use the word hypothetical. Hypotheticals to me sounds murky and non-scientific.
Yeah, I mean, there's always some, hypothesis, right, that you're trying to prove or disprove. But the fact of the matter is, if that's the scientific method, and if you can't prove or disprove the hypothesis, then you just kind of spiral into oblivion.
Hey, so Kurt, let me take you back a little bit. So the 40B, this guidance came out for this SAF credit, first time ever tax credit for sustainable aviation fuel. That tax credit expires at the end of this year, right? At the end of 2024. And so I know we were looking at this as being sort of a parlay into what the 45Z is going to look like, which includes the SAF, includes credit for SAF, but also for biodiesel and renewable diesel. So can you talk a little bit about the timing of all of that and why, what's happening with SAF currently and the availability of this tax credit, but also kind of we should talk a little bit about where we see this and what it means for not just SAF, but for other fuels as well come, I guess, January, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 40B blender's tax credit for SAF only exists for 2023 and 2024. So you might wonder why we engage so heavily on getting it right for a tax credit that, quite frankly, is going to be underutilized, if utilized at all, before it expires here at the end of this year. The answer is simple. We engaged on it both to ensure our feedstock providers, our crop-based oil production, soybean or canola, would be treated fairly under it. But obviously, there is a potential for SAF production to occur in 2024 that could be eligible for this tax incentive. So we wanted to make sure it got it right from that perspective. But even more importantly, in our view, is this 40B incentive and the framework to implement the carbon reduction component of it, in our view, is going to be the precedent for the 45Z tax credit, which exists for all fuels, not just aviation, not just diesel, but across the board. Replacement of petroleum with lower carbon intense fuels across the spectrum. And so it was critically important for us to make sure that we understood the science and the basis for the modeling for 40B, because if they got it wrong, or if we missed the boat on something significant in 40B, the federal government acts a lot like a barge going down the Mississippi River. Once it's headed in that direction, it's awfully hard to, stop it, steer it a little bit offline, or heaven's sakes, turn it around, right? So it was critically important to make sure that we got this as right as we possibly could, because it's going to be looked at for the 45Z construct. I think this might be a good segue for Veronica. So we saw in December that the initial guidance that came out said, hey, GREET will satisfy the statutory requirement for carbon modeling, but not GREET in its current form. So maybe you can tell us what is included in this update that we saw that came out April 30th that is of consequence that we haven't seen in a GREET model before. Yeah. Maybe tell us, what came out of this that fuel producers need to understand in terms of the impact of the score now of our fuels.
Yeah, and I would just add one more thing to Donnell's question. From a technical perspective, 40B SAF production, those are the same facilities that can produce renewable diesel, of course, with some modifications. But once you have the ability to produce SAF, you can still be producing renewable diesel. And so it's really important that you have parity between renewable diesel and SAF coming out of the same facility, right? You can't have two different methodologies, substantially different, and have that make sense. I feel like that would be from an environmental perspective, pretty market distorting outcome. But to your question, Kurt, I think there are two big things. The first, unfortunately, brings us back to talking about indirect effects. So in the statutory language of 40B, of course, there's two methodology options to calculating the CI score for the fuel. The ICAO CORSIA program that I mentioned, as well as this, quote, similar methodology that I'm going to unquote because I can't remember the exact language, but essentially that complies with the Clean Air Act and the definition of life cycle emissions for the renewable fuel standard. And so then you get into the legalese of, digesting what that is. And basically EPA under the RFS, in addition to modeling the indirect effects of land use change that a lot of folks are more familiar with, they also really modeled the indirect effects and so emissions associated with changes in the non-feedstock crop production, as well as livestock. So, for soy, for example, you produce more soy oil, you're producing more soy meal. And so how does that impact the livestock industry? So those are two kind of categories of emissions were not already in GREET. They're very unique to the renewable fuel standard. And so in EPA's kind of consultation, it seems that they said to folks, well, GREET's got to capture these emissions categories as well. The second piece was, I think, beneficial to fuel production. So kind of emission reduction opportunities that are not kind of inherent in GREET itself, but that were kind of created new pathways between things that GREET was already doing. So having options to reduce your CI score relative to using renewable natural gas rather than petroleum-based natural gas, to incorporating carbon capture sequestration, as well as the use of green hydrogen, which brings in a whole host of other kind of nuances to the application of, I think, this tax credit. Because of that green hydrogen tax credit, we also have using the GREET model with 45V, but I won't belabor that. So there's just a few opportunities to reduce emissions, as well as this kind of icky indirect emissions component to it too.
So at the end of the day, all of these carbon reduction strategies that are now incorporated into this for 40B, I mean, the goal here, the motivation is to recognize the financial incentive to do these carbon reduction strategies in order to get a higher value for the credit. Is that the intention here? Is that how it's expected to work?
Yeah, I mean, and my little nerdy environmental self thinks it's actually pretty cool, right? So you're using a transportation-based policy to impact emissions across that whole fuel supply chain. So you're implicating industry, the fuel production itself. You're implicating agriculture with our feedstocks. So you're really, to me, again, as a nerd, it's a pretty cool way to try to help reduce emissions economy-wide through a single policy.
So for an industry like the biomass-based diesel industry that utilizes a range of feedstocks, we've got crop-based feedstocks, soybean oil, canola. We also have waste fats, oils, and greases like used cooking oil, animal fats, and distillers corn oil. So looking at the update to the GREET for 40B, how did our feedstocks fare? Do they all qualify? At what rate do they qualify? Is this a good outcome in your view, or more work to be done?
Yeah, I think it is a good outcome. Using the GREET model under 40B, unfortunately, canola, kind of under baseline assumptions, does not qualify. But I think we were really concerned that none of the crop-based fuels were going to qualify, and soy does, kind of as a baseline. It seems like there's a lot of opportunity for the growth for SAF production for that feedstock in particular, and the rest of the suite of waste oils and greases, deco, tallow, UCO, those all qualify as well. So I think we're in a really good place to be able to get tax credits for our fuel production.
And as a qualified feedstock, they'll get a minimum of $1.25 per gallon as a blender's tax credit, going up to $1.75 as the carbon intensity is reduced.
Yeah, exactly. So, the analysis that I did to say, this qualifies, this doesn't qualify, is all based on kind of what we'll call national average numbers. But if you're going to use the GREET model to get the blender's tax credit, you have to put in the details of, your feedstock input, your fuel output, and some of those energy inputs like hydrogen and natural gas and electricity and all of that. And so every facility is going to have a unique tax credit score. But we kind of did, this is roughly what we would expect based on kind of the average for the industry.
Another area of the focus of the Inflation Reduction Act, I think billions of dollars were directed to USDA to support demonstration projects in the area of climate smart agriculture, a term that probably before 2022 most folks weren't familiar with. What is a climate smart ag practice? But importantly, the guidance on 40B that we saw on April 30th includes for the first time a recognition that sustainability practices on a farm have benefits to carbon emissions and energy intensity. Can you tell us what was included in 40B recognizing climate smart ag practices? How significant is that? What does it mean for a corn or soybean farmer?
Yeah, so this was an interesting development. I think we were, again, also really concerned that we weren't going to have that opportunity to do climate smart ag and get benefits from it. But generally, the rule says that if you employ a certain number of practices for corn or soy, you'll be able to get an emissions benefit.
This is the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast. Fascinating ideas and conversations in the world of biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel.
Yeah, I'm Donnell Rehagen, and we're visiting today with Kurt Kovarik and Veronica Bradley on the outcome and what we've learned about 40B. So you guys pick up where we left off.
Sure. Well, we've talked a lot about 40B and the new GREET model and the climate smart ag practices that are included, and the precedent that this sets for implementation of the next important tax framework, and that is the clean fuel production credit. And Veronica, I know, unfortunately, all the work that you did on 40B, your work doesn't stop there, because they indicated they're going to include a new carbon model or new GREET model update to implement 45Z. So as you surely have been poring over all of the documents and the outcome from 40B, what's on your priority list in terms of advocacy with either Argonne or DOE or USDA for that matter, to figure out where they got it wrong on 40B or areas of improvement for 45Z?
Yeah, I think they did a lot of really good work, especially given the tight time. I know part of the advocacy you did was to maybe get a little more time to get this right before switching over to a new tax credit idea. But I think that given the amount of time they had and their resources, they did a pretty good job. I think the focus now is to expand on that to make sure that we're getting the full suite of transportation fuels involved, as well as all of the different ways that we can reduce carbon intensity through the production process. So I think I was mentioning, on Climate Smart Ag, we have these kind of blanket numbers. So for soy, if you can do no-till and have a cover crop, then you can get this negative 5 grams of carbon intensity. That is great. I mean, it's actually about, not quite 60% reduction relative to that national number for soy. So that really does do quite a lot. And for corn, it's, negative 10, but you have to do cover cropping, no-till, and use EEFs or enhanced efficiency fertilizers. And so I think it's making sure that all of the feedstocks can qualify for those sorts of things. So adding canola to that mix, as well as the winter annual oil seeds that we talk about, camelina, carinata, pennycress, making sure that they can take advantage of those climate smart practices. And also really, I think a big part of that too for the winter annual oil seeds is making sure that cover cropping isn't a forced practice with these other practices for that summer crop, to make sure that you can be able as a farmer to decide, rather than planting rye, I'm probably going to get the zones wrong because I'm not actually a farmer, but, instead of planting rye, I'm going to plant pennycress, right? And so be able to get the benefit that way, which we know is going to provide kind of externality benefits that we can't really capture in the tax credit with, soil health and improved water quality and things like that. But so I think beyond that, again, I said with the fuel production side, I think it's making sure, we have green hydrogen in here for the SAF production, but on the biodiesel side, while the industry is not necessarily quite there yet, the methanol industry, that is, like green methanol is another potential lever that producers could pull on to reduce the CI score for biodiesel, I think in a really productive way if we can get green methanol off the ground.
So I think I'm hearing you say that there's two efforts on climate smart ag, and that is ensuring that they're not required to be an all or nothing approach. I think under 40B, this concept of bundling them, you had to, in the case of corn ethanol or corn production, you had to adopt all 3 climate smart ag practices that they included, which were no-till, cover crops, and enhanced fertilizer. And soy, it was just the 2, no-till and cover crops, but you had to do them all. So I think what we're hearing from USDA, which is very positive and very reasonable and rational in our view, is that there should be some benefit given to a whole suite of climate smart ag practices and kind of a la carte approach where you might be able to do some and not others, which makes a lot of sense. I've learned a lot about cover crops in the last couple of years as the interest and excitement, and not only in utilizing them as a feedstock for our fuel, but as a sustainability practice. But I've learned that they don't work everywhere.
Right.
There are the northern states don't have a long enough growing season or time period to utilize a cover crop. So it's unreasonable perhaps for USDA to require that they be bundled. But, I know that USDA has spent a lot of time and effort using a lot of the funds from the Inflation Reduction Act to try to build out maybe hundreds of climate smart ag practices. Are they all do they all have a score in a GREET model to be able to select from a pull-down menu? Do we have any idea how much work is going to be needed there to measure the carbon reduction benefits of 100 different climate-smart ag practices?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done. So the GREET model has a few different modules, is what I call them. They're different spreadsheets that can kind of feed into that larger model. And one of those is that feedstock carbon intensity calculator, where you can, at the field level, pull down kind of options of no-till, cover crops, manure management, sort of like manure spreading, kind of sort of those different practices that they've already incorporated through DOE research. And so there's a few other things that are in there that could maybe make its way more readily because they're already in this carbon intensity calculator. But again, that's like a field level thing. And I think that that's not necessarily practically implementable for a fuel producer to be able to figure out what's happening on every field at that level of granularity to capture that CI benefit at that level. But I do think that there are some things that can be done utilizing kind of some of the other tools that maybe USDA has, like Comet Farm, to get a general idea on a regional basis. You're saying, like cover cropping doesn't really work in the north, right? But there may be other practices that can get you even more benefit that maybe should be utilized in the north. So we could do some more regional look at those environmental outcomes and those benefits, and still take that practices-based approach that's more easily implementable by the regulator, and incorporate kind of a better idea of that kind of disparate environmental outcomes, to be able to promote that benefit in a more easily digestible way.
And I know that USDA, I think, has announced publicly, at least they've shared with us, that they intend to move forward with a RFI, request for information, essentially information gathering on many of these issues related to USDA, whether it's climate smart ags. One that we've been tracking closely at Clean Fuels is additional feedstocks. There's a whole host of primarily cover crops that are also winter annual oil seeds that could be utilized for feedstock for our fuels that aren't currently included in GREET. So I think this provides us an opportunity to ensure that USDA is looking at the right areas, asking the right questions by putting out this RFI. So I think that's positive, and surely we'll be actively engaged in that, right?
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to seeing the questions they have. And I think people should really, really pay attention to what's in that RFI, and if they have opinions to share them, because this is going to be a whole industry effort to try to figure out the best way to do this in a timely way that can be beneficial for 45Z.
And a number of the climate reduction strategies that we spoke about for 40B, carbon capture and storage, other areas that seem to be more targeted towards an ethanol producer or SAF producer's carbon intensity. Do you anticipate any type of carbon reduction strategies for, the supply chain of the oil? I mean, we have soy processing facilities or oilseed crush facilities. Is the RFI an opportunity for those folks to weigh in with measures that they can take to reduce carbon that should be given credit under this new model?
Frankly, I would love to see, in an ideal world, that all opportunities to reduce the CI throughout the supply chain can be used in the modeling. I think there's a couple of things. There seems to be a lot more opportunity for corn ethanol. They start with a much higher CI score than soy biodiesel, so there are places that they have more kind of localized impacts like CCS to make that reduction. So we're kind of starting from a lower baseline from which we can kind of pull on those levers, which, frankly, is in one side is kind of a good thing, right? Because we're starting with more profitability on the tax credit than our counterparts. But then, of course, makes it more difficult to pull, one lever really well, if you will. But I do think, soy oil processing, it contributes not a whole ton to the CI score of soy biodiesel, but certainly as kind of an industrial point source of those greenhouse gas emissions. And I think it would be a great opportunity if the processors could get an option to prove that they're using, renewable electricity or renewable natural gas, or I don't know as much about their energy inputs, but the different ways that they can reduce CI, have that opportunity for them as well to show that through the supply chain. Because really, especially if we get good leverage on climate smart ag, we're going to have some level of traceability to capture those benefits. And so the processor is going to have to be involved anyway. And so, might as well have the data that they're creating for their own process, be able to go down the supply chain to show that benefit for the fuel producer.
And Donnell, that RFI, while it presents a lot of opportunities for us to weigh in, it also means that the timeline on 45Z final guidance might be a little bit longer in the waiting than we had hoped for. Timing on this is hopefully we'll see an RFI soon, and then they'll use that information to put out a proposal that would be open then for public comment.
Not before I get my plan together, right?
That's right.
So it's soon enough to get it out, but not before I can
yes.
get us lined up.
And hopefully we see something in terms of a proposal before the end of the summer. I think would be maybe optimistic, but for folks who are planning on knowing exactly what 45Z will look like, unfortunately, we're going to be running into the fall for sure, which is not ideal for a tax incentive that begins January 1 of 2025, and many folks are entering into contracts for feedstock or fuel well before that.
Well, it certainly, I think, reiterates the point that how important it's going to be for interested parties to weigh into that RFI process and to provide some insight for the government to utilize before they finalize 45Z. That time frame is still going to be very tight, so everybody's going to have to be Johnny on the spot here in the next few months to be ready to provide that guidance. And it behooves us to do that, right? We're trying to help 45Z be more reflective of what can be beneficial to our fuel producers, our feedstock producers, maybe than what we saw in 40B. And I think at the end of the day, you're looking at a 45Z process, a tax credit under the 45Z for all three of those fuels, much, much more complex for sure than anything we've been used to historically for biodiesel and renewable diesel, right? $1 a gallon on every gallon was pretty easy to figure out. Well, that's going to go by the wayside, and we're now going to be in this whole carbon intensity reduction model that is going to increase the sophistication that we're all going to have as feedstock growers, feedstock processors, fuel producers, if we really want to maximize the benefit of that credit.
And to some extent, I think the 40B credit was it was a steep learning curve for everybody in this space. But what it did was it forced everybody to kind of figure this out and get a better understanding of it. And I think we're in a better position now as we head into 45Z because we're educated, we understand the impacts, and we can look at 40B and understand the good parts of it and hopefully try to have an impact on some of the bad parts of it as we develop 45Z.
Yeah, I think you're right, though. It's going to take some patience for all of us in the industry. We'd love to have those answers for 45Z today or a month ago, and we're just not going to get that. So we're going to have to be patient and work with the process. And we've been given an opportunity to impact it, hopefully, through this RFI and rulemaking. So we're going to have to fully engage and bring everything that we've got to the table and make sure that what comes out of it is going to be to the most benefit it can be for us.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess let's just end it there. So thank you guys a bunch, Kurt, Veronica, for spending a little bit of time. It's a very complex subject, and we've learned a lot over the last couple of weeks, and it's obviously going to be a summer of learning a whole lot more. And so appreciate you all helping us and our listeners figure out what's going on with 40B. So thanks again for being with us.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, always happy to help.
All right, thanks. Another great episode, lots of information. If you enjoy the podcast and you got a moment, it really does help us if you give us a rating. It helps us grow and get more awareness. And if you really want to go for it, just leave us a review. We might just read it here, so please do that wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have any questions for our experts or suggestions for future topics or guests, you can email us at podcasts@cleanfuels.org. And join us next week for another episode of the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. To catch all the latest from Clean Fuels Alliance America, follow us at cleanfuels.org. The Better, Cleaner, Now podcast is a production of Clean Fuels Alliance America. That's all for us. Now it's your turn to be better, cleaner, now.